Hello and welcome to the very first broadcast of The World This Week from our studio in Santa Monica, California. I'm Matthew Ware, a student at Santa Monica High School and the anchor of this program. We hope to create a weekly or bi-weekly program with a new perspective on the past week's news. We won't be the first place to break these stories, but we can have our take on them after everyone else has had theirs. We hope to have guests, panels, and interviews on the program in the future, but for today we'll look back at the world this week. The 11th anniversary of the September 11th terror attacks and what it means for us. The case against California's Proposition 8 is advancing to the Supreme Court. An anti-Muslim internet video is causing sometimes violent demonstrations outside U.S. embassies throughout the Middle East, and two tax increases are competing against each other on the November ballot, which might cause neither to pass and jeopardize California public schools. We'll be back after this break. I want to begin with the late commemoration of an anniversary. Of course, this past Tuesday was the 11th anniversary of the September 11th terror attacks. I was 5 years old on that day in 2001, and it was my second day of kindergarten. I wasn't fully aware of what had happened, but I knew my uncle worked in Lower Manhattan and that my family was worried about him. Luckily, he wasn't one of the nearly 3,000 people who perished that day. I wasn't fully aware of what had happened on that day in 2001, but I grew up in a nation and a world that was profoundly changed by it. When I was a bit older, I started reading Newsweek magazine and the LA Times, and I would ask my parents about my opinions and start to develop my own. So it was only later that I would start thinking about the attacks and what they meant for our country. In the decade that followed that day, we started the two longest wars in our nation's history. One of them is still ongoing. Before the attack, we condemned other nations for using torture. Afterwards, we tortured detainees we held without trial. Before the attack, no one had heard of Homeland Security or the phrase enemy combatant. The organization that attacked us, Al-Qaeda, has seen its leaders picked off one by one, including the mastermind of 9/11, Osama bin Laden. But before that could happen, we became, in many ways, a nation more divided and more scared. When we walked into airports, we heard if the terror threat level was yellow, or orange, or red. We learned about anthrax, and the shoe bomber. We heard about the underwear bomber, how Sharia law was invading, and how there was a war on Christmas. How Saddam Hussein had nuclear weapons until it turned out that he didn't. The wars we waged in response to the attacks cost the lives of more than 5,000 soldiers and added trillions of dollars to our national debt, and Americans still don't agree on why we fought them, or if we should have. The attacks of September 11th had a profound impact on our nation, but maybe the way we respond to them has affected us even more. We can't let our fears define who we are, because if we do, we threaten our democracy. Thanks. We'll be back after the break. So next up is the Proposition 8 case, which the Supreme Court should hear when its session begins this October. The most recent news is that the case was just appealed to the Supreme Court by the same people who put Proposition 8 on the ballot all the way back in 2008, but I want to take a bit of time to remember how we got here. I'll start with two names you might have heard, Theodore Olson and David Boies. Those names are important because they were the lawyers for Bush and Gore in the 2000 election dispute. Theodore Olson is a conservative Republican, and David Boies is a liberal Democrat. But when Proposition 8 passed, they joined together to sue the state of California over a law they thought was discriminatory and wrong. Since they've done that, a federal judge in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals both said that Proposition 8 was unconstitutional, that it violated the 14th Amendment when it gave the right of marriage only to men marrying women and women marrying men. The testimony in these cases is also interesting because both sides brought in experts on the history of marriage, and the idea that marriage was just between a man and a woman started to fall apart. Because before that, marriage was between a white man and a white woman, or a black man and a black woman, but not both. And before that, marriage could be between a man and many women. That was okay, but not between a woman and many men. Also, slaves couldn't marry, and slavery itself was acceptable. So every time the institution of marriage has changed, it's changed to become more just. The other interesting thing is that some of the chief witnesses for the Proposition 8 side refused to be cross-examined, and the ones who were cross-examined seemed to agree with Mr. Olson and Mr. Boies. A chief witness, Mr. Blankenhorn, wrote an essay in the New York Times the other day saying he now supported gay marriage. So there are basically three things the Supreme Court could do now, assuming it takes up the case in October. It could make gay marriage legal all across the country, or it could make gay marriage illegal all across the country in sweeping decisions, sort of like Roe v. Wade, the abortion case in the 1970s. But a lot of experts think that those things aren't the most likely things that are going to happen. A lot of people think that they could make a narrow decision affecting only California. We'll keep you informed as this progresses. We'll be right back. As you probably heard, there was an attack on a U.S. consulate in Libya near Benghazi last week. 4 Americans, including the U.S. ambassador to Libya, Chris Stevens, were killed. And as you probably also heard, an anti-Muslim video made just a few miles from here in Cerritos, California, sparked outrage throughout the Middle East when it was translated by an Egyptian news network. What you may not have heard is that so far as we know, those two things have absolutely nothing to do with each other. The advantage of reporting after the fact is that we can be more careful with our facts, and we're not going to make the same mistake the news did last Tuesday. So let's start with the attack on the consulate. In a town outside Benghazi, there was a protest going on about this video, but as local reporters from Al Jazeera explain, it was a peaceful protest for the most part, and certainly no one was killed because of it. What happened was men armed with rocket-propelled grenades and heavy artillery showed up in pickup trucks with black flags and sieged the consulate, causing the deaths of our ambassador and 3 other Americans in the city they helped save from Gaddafi's forces more than a year ago in the Libyan civil war. Everything points to this being a planned attack. We don't know who was behind the attack, although some local militant organizations tried to claim credit for it. We also know that Al-Qaeda put out a statement encouraging terror attacks to avenge the deaths of its leaders, but we don't know if there was any connection between that and what happened at the consulate on Tuesday. Christopher Stevens was a great diplomat, and he was essential to the American effort in the Libyan civil war. He and the security officers of the compound, 2 of them were former Navy SEALs, they'll be greatly missed. As for the video, there were protests in 11 countries outside U.S. embassies as of today. Some of them were peaceful, but a lot of them were more violent and riot-like. In Egypt, the protesters tried to storm the embassy. They took down the American flag and put up a black flag. In Yemen, there were clashes with police and some demonstrators were even killed. And one of the things that I think is interesting about these protests is this assumption, this false assumption that a lot of the protesters are making. When NBC's foreign correspondent Richard Engel asked them, they said they were angry that the United States hadn't censored the video or hadn't taken it down. And they thought the US government somehow had control over this video, and by not removing it, the Obama administration had sanctioned the video. In other words, it's a misunderstanding of the freedom of speech, which actually makes sense given that these are countries where that right hasn't existed for decades, maybe never. So I think maybe instead of just asserting that we have the freedom of speech, we should educate people about what it means and why it's good. Maybe one of the best things we could do to help the new democracies of the Arab Spring become successful and stable. We'll be right back. Today we'll close with news closer to home in my state of California. California faces a budget crisis, and in June this year a budget was approved with $5.9 billion of cuts, and out of those $4.8 billion are to schools. These cuts would go into place if Jerry Brown's tax increase measure, Proposition 30, doesn't pass this November. Brooks Allen, a lawyer from the Southern California ACLU who monitors compliance with the landmark case Williams v. California, says that it could cause up to 20 school days to be cut from the year in lower-income districts that don't have much local funding. But it's not that simple because there isn't just one tax increase measure on the ballot, there are 2. The other is Proposition 38. We'll go through both measures today, what the differences are, and why they both might lose. Proposition 30, Jerry Brown's initiative, is backed by the California Teachers Association and most state Democrats. It would increase taxes on people earning more than $300,000 per year, as well as increase the sales tax by half a cent to fill the $5.9 billion budget gap and avoid the trigger cuts which were also created by Jerry Brown. The end result is that education funding would stay where it is now. Proposition 38 is largely funded by activist and philanthropist Molly Munger, and it's supported by the statewide PTA, which is a smaller organization than the Teachers Association, but still an important one. It would increase taxes on many more state voters. It would still have an emphasis on the wealthy, but a single taxpayer making $50,000 a year would pay about $300 more, although a family making the same amount wouldn't pay any more. They put a tax calculator on the website so you can see how much your taxes would personally increase. But more importantly, it would increase funding over 12 years instead of a temporary measure that Brown's is, and would represent a big new investment in education. So Molly Munger, who supports Proposition 38, actually called for a yes vote on both measures. And Senator Dianne Feinstein, who supports Jerry Brown's measure, called for a truce between the two campaigns, but it hasn't really happened. John Koupel, who's the president of the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, said this: "When your adversaries are engaged in a battle, the best thing to do is step out of the way. We've seen some pretty aggressive posturing between the two, and I don't see that letting up between now and November." You may remember the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association as the people behind Proposition 13, one of the worst things that ever happened to California schools. Recent polls suggest that if the election were held today, Proposition 30 would win 54 to 36% of the vote, and Proposition 38 would lose 40% to 49%. But when voters were showed ads from both campaigns, support declined and opposition increased a few points. And most of the hard-hitting outs that anti-tax groups will put on the airwaves haven't even been out yet. And just this June, do you remember there was a cigarette tax to fund cancer research? And it had overwhelming support before the election, but it lost by a narrow margin because tobacco companies and anti-tax groups ran millions of dollars in ads in the weeks leading up to the election. So California voters should know as much as possible about each measure, but they should also know about the very real possibility that voting for just one could defeat both. That's all for the World This Week. You can go to worldthisweek.org for more information and links to other projects. But for now, thanks for watching. Goodbye.